From from the very beginning of his presidency, Lincoln walked a fragile line. He only won 40% of the popular vote in the 1860 election, and while obviously he had little support in the South, there was a sizable opposition to his presidency in the North as well. Lincoln's very election in November had sparked a crisis before he was even inaugurated in March of 1861. He spent the winter in Springfield, Illinois, watching helplessly as one state after another seceded because of him. And he had not even taken office yet. From the first day of taking office in March, Lincoln was in a crisis mode, and a month later in war mode. And from then on, things just got worse. From the very beginning, he faced a threat from within the border states, particularly in Maryland, where he had to suspend the writ of habeas corpus to suppress the secessionist movement. The disaster of Bull Run in Manassas in June, then his inability to spur General George McClellan into action further had dragged Lincoln's presidency further down. But the pressure came not only from at home, but from abroad as well. James McPherson, in chapter 18 of our textbook, extensively describes the pressure on Lincoln that was coming from Europe, from Britain and France in particular. The crisis with Britain began with the Trent affair, and it would have substantial impact on Canada as well. The Confederate president, Jefferson Davis, had appointed James M. Mason of Virginia and John Slidell of Louisiana as commissioners or Confederate ambassadors to represent Confederate interests abroad. Mason in England and Slidell in France. They managed to sail past the Union blockade at Charleston Harbor and made their way to Cuba, where they boarded in Havana the Trent, a British postal steamer. U.S. naval intelligence found out about the passenger, and as the Trent, with the two commissioners aboard, sailed into the Bahamas Channel on November 8, 1861, a U.S. Navy vessel fired two warning shots across its bow, forced it to stop, and naval personnel boarded it and arrested and hauled the two Confederate commissioners off the ship and brought them back to the United States as prisoners. This, of course, was a challenge to the supremacy of the British Navy on the high seas. The U.S. offered a novel interpretation of international maritime law. A nation at war, it was generally agreed, had the right to stop and search a neutral merchant ship if it suspected that ship of carrying the enemy's dispatches. And so the United States argued that Mason and Slidell were, in fact, Confederate dispatches by virtue of the information contained in their brain, in their memory, and therefore the U.S. had the right to remove them from this British postal steamer. The British, of course, were outraged. Already, Britain is hostile in general to the United States in this period, and as I have described before, British interests are very much tied to cotton exports from the South. As a result of the Trent crises, United States and Britain came very close to going to war. 11,000 British regular troops are sent to Canada. The British fleet was put on war footing, and a very threatening, sharp note was dispatched from Britain to the United States demanding the surrender of the prisoners and a prompt apology. This 11,000 shipment of British troops to Canada is the largest single troop deployment Britain has ever made to North America. And these 11,000 troops were supplementary to approximately 7,000 to 8,000 British troops already stationed in Canada previous to the Civil War. So we had approximately 18,000 to 19,000 British troops positioned in Canada by the winter of 1861, 1862. This also put Canadians on a preparatory path to possibly going to war with their neighbor, the United States. This is the period of the Trent crisis when many of Canada's militia regiments that are still in service today begin to be formed. Canadian militia training is revised. The Canadian militia is rearmed, carefully organized, and is essentially the birth of what's going to become the Canadian Primary Reserve, the militia, and then as well, much later, the regular Canadian Armed Forces. Can trace its roots back to the Trent crisis in 1861, 1862, some 5 years prior to Confederation, actually. Lincoln, sticking to his policy of one war at a time, eventually backed down, and an apology was made, and the Confederate ambassadors were released and allowed to proceed to France and England. By the time the British transports bearing British troops to Canada arrived off the American coast in the winter, Secretary of State Seward, by that time, the relations had so improved that Secretary of State Seward offered to let the British soldiers disembark on American soil in Maine and cross over into Canada overland, since the St. Lawrence River was frozen over and not navigable. Britain refused the offer, but nonetheless, it shows you how quickly Lincoln brought this under control. Britain will remain friendly to the Confederacy throughout the duration of the Civil War. Confederate warships will be constructed in Britain, like the CSS Florida, the CSS Alabama. These ships will attack and sink Union merchant ships around the world, even in the Indian Ocean off the coast of China. American ships will be attacked by these Confederate raiding warships. While under British law, it was illegal for British companies to supply weapons of war to belligerents, British authorities looked the other way, as these ships were built initially as merchant ships and then sailed off to the Bahamas, where they were then fitted out with guns that were sent by another route through false end-user certificates and fitted on the ships in hidden coves in the Bahamas. And False end-user certificates are still used today for smuggling weapons. The Confederates waged a public relations campaign in Britain for recognition as an independent state. To British liberal politicians, the Confederates presented themselves as not fighting for slavery, but for self-determination. To British conservative politicians, they presented themselves as a rural gentry, defending themselves against greedy northern industrialists. And in many ways, this is the way the Confederacy will be viewed by the conservative empire loyalists in Canada, as again, old school, old civilization, rural gentry that is defending themselves against this new generation of greedy northern industrialists. In other words, Canada and the Confederacy both regarded the Union with similar kinds of suspicion that we had discussed in our previous seminar. To British industrialists, the Confederates promised that, unlike the Union, the Confederate States would drop tariffs and open their ports to free trade. To textile manufacturers, they promised an unlimited supply of cheap slave-produced cotton. The issue of cotton was so important in Britain that the Confederacy had deliberately embargoed its own cotton exports to Britain, cutting their supply to 1/3 of what had been before the war. This alone was cause for some British politicians and policymakers to consider not only recognition of the Confederate States, but perhaps even direct intervention in the war on behalf of the Confederacy. The French, in the meantime, were taking advantage of American weakness in the continent and now sent troops into Mexico in an attempt to make that territory a French colony, realizing that the U.S. was in no shape to enforce its long-standing Monroe Doctrine, which called for war against any European nation intervening in the Western Hemisphere. Lincoln finds the Republican Party split now between two factions, a minority conservative faction and a majority radical faction. And it's the radical faction that will introduce a controversial confiscation bill that emancipates all slaves of persons engaged in rebellion against the Union. This bill I'll discuss further in detail, but the bill was very problematic because it did not define what exactly constituted rebellion and was, of course, unconstitutional in those states where slavery had previously existed. Lincoln only reluctantly signed the bill. Lincoln, of course, will eventually issue the Emancipation Proclamation on his own. Historians debate to this day what inspired Lincoln to proclaim this Emancipation Proclamation. Were these battlefield failures that the Union was experiencing in 1862 forcing Lincoln to essentially introduce emancipation and sell it as a radical way of resolving the war by robbing the South of its slave labor and his deep hidden desire to abolish slavery. We know certainly that Lincoln was very tolerant of slavery and certainly tolerant of the institution of slavery where it existed, whether he personally abhorred slavery or not. Or did Lincoln perhaps turn to emancipation as a cynical means by which to defeat the Confederacy by freeing their slaves in the hope that they would escape? The differences here are subtle but significant. Lincoln is pondering issuing the Emancipation Proclamation in the summer of 1862. And he's advised by Seward to wait until he has a battlefield victory to make that question palatable to Americans, not to make it look like a desperate gambit. And throughout the summer of 1862, Lincoln is, of course, his troops are not achieving any kind of distinct and clear victory on the field. The Battle of Shiloh in April, although a victory, cost an unacceptable amount of casualties, as again I described in the previous lecture. And throughout the summer, of course, George McClellan is forced out of his Peninsular campaign as he was slowly moving towards Richmond. And eventually, McClellan will withdraw from the peninsula and return with his Army of the Potomac back to Washington. Emancipation itself had been a popular issue, but not one that the majority of Americans were prepared to fight and die for. This war was about suppressing secession, about reconstructing the Union, not about freeing slaves. And to make it into that while the Union was facing defeat was not a good idea. In August, while Lincoln secretly pondered the wisdom of emancipation, publicly, for the record, this is what Lincoln says. Quote, "My paramount object in this struggle is to save the Union, and it is not either to save or to destroy slavery. If I could save the Union without freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. What I do about slavery and the colored race, I do because it helps to save the Union. I shall do less whenever I shall believe what I'm doing hurts the cause, and I shall do more whenever I shall believe doing more will help the cause." End of quote. The next month, on September 17th, 1862, Lincoln will get his battlefield victory at Antietam in Sharpsburg, Maryland. Here you can see April, July of 1862. Thomas Jackson had driven George McClellan's troops away from Richmond and Petersburg back across the peninsula, and McClellan withdraws. Shortly after that, Robert E. Lee will launch an attack northward. The attack is targeting essentially Baltimore. He's hoping that he'll swing around Baltimore, cut off Washington from all those railway connections, and then drive on to Philadelphia, presumably. And on September 17th, at Antietam, you have this clash. It's again the highest one-day battle combat deaths in the history of the United States, right up till today. Some 23,000 soldiers from both sides will be killed in this battle. And while it stops the Confederate invasion of the North into Maryland, the battle will have little effect later on the conduct of the war. But it is indeed this horrific battle. The Union will, as I say, drive the Confederacy out of Maryland, but will fail to destroy the Confederate army of Robert E. Lee of Northern Virginia. And Robert E. Lee successfully will escape with most of his army intact and reposition himself at Fredericksburg in Virginia. Here you can see some of the photographs taken at Sharpsburg or Antietam. Sharpsburg is how the battle is called in the South. Antietam is how the North refers it to. The bloodiest single-day battle in American history, as I said. 23,000 casualties in one day. But nominally, this battle is a victory for the North, despite the casualties. And it gives now Lincoln just exactly the kind of victory, as costly as it was, for him to now announce on September 22nd, 1862, his Emancipation Proclamation, which is to take effect on January 1st, 1863. The proclamation comes under presidential powers, kind of an executive order. It's not an act of Congress, but it does give Lincoln the legendary moniker of the Great Emancipator. It's not necessarily a moniker that Lincoln earns, because there are all sorts of loopholes in the proclamation. You can see from the text of the proclamation that, first of all, only slaves in territories in rebellion against the United States shall be made free. Exact text states that all persons held as slaves within any state or designated part of a state, the people whereof shall then be in rebellion against the United States shall be thenceforward and forever free. So, firstly, this emancipates only slaves in Confederate territory, in rebellion. It doesn't free slaves in the Union, for example, in Maryland, which is a slave state, or Washington, D.C., which is slave territory, or other states that are part of the Union but free, like Delaware, for example. So it does nothing for slaves in the Union slave states, Missouri, Kentucky, Maryland, Delaware. Not named is also the state of Tennessee, which Union armies already took control of. Slaves in Tennessee will not be controlled or freed. When we talk about designated part of a state, for example, there are specific exemptions for 48 counties that would soon become West Virginia. 7 other named and Union-occupied counties of Virginia itself. For New Orleans, which is under control of the Union, and 13 nearby named parishes already under Union control, and all areas under Union control by January 1st, 1863 will also be exempt when the proclamation is to take effect. This provision, of course, is the time between the announcement in September and its taking effect in January is to give Confederate states time to rejoin the Union and thus be allowed to keep their slaves. In other words, Lincoln is inviting back Confederate states into the Union and rewarding them if they do so by allowing them to keep their slaves. And in fact, I may have mentioned this in other lectures. Prior to the issuance of the proclamation, whenever slaves escaped from Confederate territory across the front into Union territory, the Union Army would return escaped slaves, back to the Confederacy during the war. And this, of course, was because of the constitutional obligation that the Union had to extradite slaves as per the 1850 Compromise Agreement and the 1850 Fugitive Slave Law. So clearly, if in the first year of the war the Union is returning slaves back to the Confederacy, clearly this war had not begun as a war to emancipate the slaves. So paradoxically, Lincoln's great Emancipation Proclamation only freed those slaves outside Union jurisdiction. What Lincoln, it's said, was hoping for was a mass uprising, or at least an escape of slaves in Confederate territories who were doing the work of whites who were currently serving in the Confederate Army. The mass escape never came. The reasons why are debated. Some argue that Confederate censorship and disinformation dissuaded slaves from attempting to escape to the Union. Slaves were told that the Union intended to hitch them to wagons instead of horses and mules. Many slaves did not feel compelled to escape. And some would remain with their masters as employees or sharecroppers after the fall of the Confederacy. Sometimes some felt it was better to remain where they were, where they knew their condition, rather than risking something worse and something unknown. Lincoln was not the first in the Union to free slaves. Congress had already acted twice. On August 6th, 1861, Congress passed the first Confiscations Act, which provided for the confiscation of slaves used for the Confederate war effort. The act read as follows, that, quote, that whenever hereafter, during the present insurrection against the government of the United States, any person claimed to be held to labor or service under the law of any state shall be required or permitted by the person to whom such labor or service is claimed to be due, or by the lawful agent of such person, to take up arms against the United States, or shall be required or permitted by that person to whom such labor or service is claimed to be due, or his lawful agent, to work, to be employed in, or upon any fort, navy yard, dock, armory, ship, entrenchment, or in any military or naval service whatsoever against the government and lawful authority of the United States, then in every such case, the person to whom such labor or service is claimed to be due shall forfeit his claim to such labor, any law of the state or of the United States to the contrary notwithstanding. And whenever thereafter the person claiming such labor or service shall seek to enforce his claim, it shall be a full and sufficient answer to such claim that the person whose service or labor is claimed had been employed in hostile service against the government of the United States, contrary to the provision of this act. It did not, the first Confiscation Act, specify the fate of the slave once he is confiscated, and suggested that as, quote, property, the slave merely became now the property of the U.S. government as war booty. Quote, all such property is hereby declared to be lawfully subject of prize and capture whenever found. So essentially, the Union in the first Confiscation Act recognizes slaves as slaves, although they don't use that term, but they recognize slaves as slaves that can be then confiscated as war booty, as property, as slaves, and put to work for the Union war effort. And that is where, of course, Confederate propaganda that escaped slaves will be hitched up to wagons and used like mules or horses by the Union has, some elements of truth to it. A year later, July 17, 1862, Congress now passes the second Confiscation Act, which now used the term slave, and it specified that slaves shall be freed forever. Quote, that all slaves of persons who shall hereafter be engaged in rebellion against the government of the United States, or who shall in any way give aid or comfort thereto, escaping from such persons and taking refuge within the lines of the army, and all slaves captured from such persons or deserted by them and coming under control of the government of the United States, and all slaves of such persons found on or being within any place occupied by rebel forces and afterwards occupied by the forces of the United States shall be deemed captives of war and shall be forever free of their servitude and not again held as slaves. End of quote. Lincoln's proclamation is slightly different. This proclamation applies again only to slaves of those owners who are engaged in rebellion. Lincoln's proclamation expands the emancipation to all slaves in Confederate territories, whether or not their owners were participating in the rebellion or were Unionists. And there certainly were slave-owning Unionists in the Confederacy, as rare as they were, but they existed. Lincoln's proclamation also included an important amendment to Lincoln's original draft, which William Seward suggested, and which will have a impact to this day. It states that the military and naval authority of the United States will recognize and maintain the freedom of such persons. What it does is, of course, it introduces to the federal government the obligation of, quote, maintaining the freedom of slaves, which eventually will be transformed into the obligation of the federal government to protect the civil rights of people in the United States. Civil rights issues and their enforcement and protection under the precedent set by the Emancipation Act will become the jurisdiction of the federal government to this day. And civil rights violations are investigated and prosecuted by the federal government. It's a federal crime to this day. So certainly we can thank William Seward for introducing this this element into the proclamation and into the legal structure of the United States vis-a-vis civil rights. This is not at all a popular action or act by Lincoln in the northern United States. Obviously, the South, I don't need to talk about that, but surprisingly, it's the North where there is as much opposition to the emancipation of slaves or any civil rights issues as there could be in the Confederacy. And we've talked about that before, and I'll just once again remind everybody here of just how anti-progressive civil rights were, in particular in the issue of voting in the United States. We could see that when the United States rolled out its Constitution in 1790, 23% of its 13 states, nearly a quarter, either restricted or prohibited blacks from voting. By 1855, on the eve of the war, 80% of the now 31 states had prohibitions and restrictions on African Americans voting. And that does not include the state of New York that had required African Americans, unlike whites, to have a certain amount of property before being allowed to vote. And so we can see that as the United States advanced through the century chronologically, it increased rather than decreased the recognition of the rights of African Americans to vote and, of course, other rights. And it's mostly northern states that we see these restrictions: Ohio, New Jersey, Indiana, Connecticut, Illinois, New York, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, California. All these free labor states are actually introducing restrictions on African American civil rights. In the South, the emancipation, of course, is seen as something evil and satanic, as Jefferson Davis called it. But opposition from the South, of course, is irrelevant. They're at war. Opposition from factions in the North is more problematic, where, again, Lincoln is seen as communing with the devil in his choice to emancipate the slaves. Conservative Republicans who wanted a more gradual emancipation turned against Lincoln now, claiming that emancipation would permanently destroy any future hope of reconciliation with the South. Northern Democrats, in the meantime, some of them referred to as peace Democrats, coalesce into a growing opposition movement to the war, nicknamed the Copperheads, called so for the kind of identifying pins they produced from clipping copper penny liberty heads. While the Copperheads support the Union, they oppose the war. They will oppose the draft when it will be signed into law in March of 1863. The Copperheads argue that abolitionists had caused the war and demanded immediate peace with the South at any cost. Some Copperheads actually begin to persuade some Union soldiers to desert. Some become outright subversive. They're plotting to help, on some occasions, Confederate prisoners of war to seize their camps and escape. Sometimes they met with Confederate agents and took money, and many were eventually arrested on Lincoln's orders and deported out of the Union into the Confederacy. Just how unpopular Lincoln's act is in the North is evidenced by a couple of things. Firstly, there's a mass of resignations from the officer corps of the Union Army. Many of the officers argue that they took up commissions in the Army to bring back the Union, to suppress the secession, but they're not prepared to fight and die now for the liberation of slaves. They never signed on for this, is their battle cry. The other impact that's immediately felt is in the 1862 midterm elections to the House of Representatives. Just to show how unpopular Lincoln's policies are, in 1862, in November, the Democrats now gained 28 seats, taking control of 39% of the seats, while the Republicans lose 22 seats and slide back to holding 46% of the seats in Congress. The conduct of the war shortly after this election is also going to be very bad for Lincoln. As winter is coming and as armies in that era tend not to fight and maneuver in cold climate, Lincoln orders General Burnside to take Fredericksburg to clear the way towards Richmond. Lincoln is still, as much as he's pursuing a war in the West, which is encircling the Confederacy as per the Anaconda Plan, he at the same time wants to take out Richmond. He sees it as a way of consolidating at least some kind of victory over the morale of the Confederacy, which is still holding out despite of all these Union advances. So December 11th to the 15th of 1862, Robert E. Lee will now fight General Burnside. Fredericksburg, of course, is distinguished by this suicidal series of Union attacks ordered by Burnside against Confederate positions dug in at Marye's Heights on the outskirts of Fredericksburg. Union troops cross the river and relatively easily get into Fredericksburg, which they then vandalize and set fire to. Getting out of Fredericksburg is going to be a little bit harder. Here, on these heights in the outskirts, known as Marye's Heights, Robert E. Lee will dig in a defensive line that is heavily outfitted with artillery batteries. And so Fredericksburg is distinguished by these suicidal Union charges across this open field and then upslope against all these entrenched and barricaded Confederate defenders. Now these slopes are but a cemetery. This is what it looks like today. Edward Porter Alexander, Confederate officer in charge of artillery, looking down from his position on the slope leading up from below towards them, commented, quote, "A chicken could not live on that field when we open up on it," end of quote. Wave after wave of Union infantry will charge into these guns and be wiped out in these charges, including these suicidal charges by Union Irish brigades, kind of the elite of the Union Army. Some will recall how these lines of Union attackers would just melt away like snow hitting warm ground. And wave after wave of Union infantry make so suicidal a charge against the Confederates that at one point the Confederate defenders begin to applaud the Union tenacity and courage to make these charges. Some say that it's at Fredericksburg that for the first time the Confederate soldiers begin to respect and understand just the tenacity and courage that the Union Army bears in the field. In any regards, 12,500 Union casualties in 3 days to 5,300 Confederate casualties in defending Marye's Heights. And here you can see the Confederate lines, a familiar picture to you all by now. This is clearly, 5,000 casualties to 12,000 casualties is clearly a victory for the Confederacy, a resounding victory over the Union. And it's a disaster for Lincoln, which follows, of course, in the casualties of Shiloh, the casualties at Antietam, and now Fredericksburg, the worst of all. It's politically just poison to Lincoln. And here you can see one of the cartoons that appeared in American press. Columbia or America asks, quote, "Where are my 15,000 sons murdered at Fredericksburg?" Lincoln, "This reminds me of a little joke." Columbia, "Go tell your joke at Springfield." So again, playing on Lincoln's reputation for telling jokes and making these humorous speeches. Lincoln's Dream, another publication with a cartoon, to the block, the chopping block, the future, the past. Here you can see all these former generals, McDowell, McClellan, Burnside, walking away with their heads chopped off. Of course, Burnside after Fredericksburg. And in the future, Seward, Stinson, and a number of other, Halleck on the far left. I'm not quite sure who the second from the left, fully bearded character is, getting ready to approach the chopping block and get their heads cut off. And Lincoln is now halfway in his presidential term. He knows by now that, November 1864, he's got to face election. Again, re-election. If he can at least get the nomination. At this point, there's even a question whether Lincoln will be renominated by the Republican Party. And radical Republicans now turn on Lincoln, demanding some kind of resolution to the war. They're not ready to publicly attack their president, but a Republican caucus in December now attacks William Seward, characterizing him as a kind of malevolent presence behind the president. Seward offers his resignation to Lincoln, but Lincoln understands that the attack is really directed at him and urges Seward to remain. Making matters even worse is that members of Lincoln's government, his cabinet members, are now feuding and conspiring against each other. In particular, his Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase. Salmon P. Chase now secretly meets with congressmen who are attempting to overthrow Seward and urges them onward. Republican congressmen now form a so-called Committee of Nine, which, without specifically naming Seward, begin to demand that Lincoln, quote, reorganize his cabinet. Meeting with Lincoln, the Committee of Nine now demand that forthwith his cabinet should jointly meet with the committee and that, quote, all important public measures and appointments shall be the result of their combined wisdom and deliberation. End of quote. And this is a direct attack on the separation of powers in the United States between the executive branch of the president and the legislative branch of Congress. The idea that there would be a committee jointly governing the United States of congressmen plus a executive cabinet appointed by the president would radically change the constitutional structure of the United States, and probably forever. And so again, Lincoln barely manages to put this attempt by congressmen to insert themselves into the executive branch decision-making process through this Committee of Nine proposal. Lincoln will begin to call these maneuvers, conspiracies, and attacks from both factions of the radical Republicans and the conservative Republicans fire in the rear, essentially meaning fire in behind the lines, fire in the rear, coming not from the battlefield, but from the rear of the battlefield, kind of ambushes. And as 1863 now begins and the war remains stalled, this fire in the rear is only going to get worse. In the winter of 1863, Lincoln proposed an act for, quote, enrolling and calling out national forces, end of quote. The Enrollment Act of Conscription, or as we commonly refer to it, the draft. This, the first effective draft by the federal government, called for all men between the ages of 18 and 45 to be enrolled into local militia units and be available to be called into national service for a period of 3 years. The draft law exempted men in some occupations, such as telegraph operators, railroad engineers, judges, and certain other government employees. Men with mental disabilities or with certain types of dependence were exempted. Physical disabilities that would exempt a man included imperfect vision in the right eye, a lack of front teeth and molars for biting open cartridges, the loss of more than one finger of the right hand or more than 2 fingers of the left hand. The actual drafting of the men would be the responsibility of the states, which would usually use a lottery system. When the government, the federal government, issues a call for more troops, each state would be given a quota to fill based on its population. The number of volunteers would be subtracted from the quota, and the difference left behind would now be drafted. If a draftee volunteered before the final muster, he avoided the stigma of compulsory service and was eligible to collect a bounty of $100 from the federal government, plus additional bounties from state and local communities. In total, in some states, these bounties could exceed $500, which was about the average yearly wage in those days. And states considered it a matter of pride to fill their quotas without having to resort to the draft. And here you can see a poster, the Conscript Bill, how to avoid it. The way you avoid the Conscript Bill, of course, is volunteering. And here, 1,000 men are called for 12 months service by the U.S. Navy. It worked similarly in the 1960s with the war in Vietnam, where if you volunteered to serve during the war period, you could choose which military arm to serve in, the Navy, the Air Force, the Marines, or the Army. And of course, those who really wanted to avoid, combat in the jungle would choose either the Air Force or the Navy. Second maybe the Army, and definitely last, the United States Marine Corps. Of course, once they're drafted, they often would be sent into the worst combat, the heaviest combat in Vietnam that was borne by the U.S. Marines. So at least if you volunteered, you had some chance and some option of avoiding the worst of combat. During the Civil War in the previous century, first of all, someone who is drafted can gain an exemption by paying a fee of $300 or by hiring a substitute. The obvious inequity of this provision, of course, prompts the cry of, quote, rich man's war, but a poor man's fight, end of quote. The bounty system also made possible the enrichment of a large number of unscrupulous con men called bounty jumpers. These men would enlist, collect their bounty, and then desert and enlist somewhere else and collect another bounty. And of course, that was easy to do in the age before you had social security numbers or digital databases, identification cards, driver's licenses, and so forth. You could shift your identity very easily. Some men formed clubs where each one contribute to a general fee, and if a member of that club was drafted, the others would pay out his commutation fee of his exemption fee. Regardless of the intent of the $300 provision, as a means of securing some much needed funding for the war effort or sparing the sons of the rich from serving similar to draft dodging, public perception among the middle and lower classes was that the war had become a rich man's war and a poor man's fight. Congress will resist Lincoln's pressure to adopt the Conscription Act, and it will eventually, however, be signed into law with congressional support on March 3rd of 1863. So it certainly takes Lincoln some time until the coming spring, winter of 1863 before he actually is able to implement the conscription. And Lincoln at this point is desperate for recruits. That's one of the reasons, again, we consider sometimes the Emancipation Proclamation being a kind of cynical act by Lincoln to attract African American volunteers in the Army. What, again, is disturbing to Lincoln are all these reports from officers that troops in the field are now demoralized and grumbling that now they're fighting for the emancipation of slaves and that they didn't sign up for this. After Fredericksburg, the Copperhead call for peace with the South on any terms begins to grow louder. In the meantime, Lincoln's Secretary of Commerce or Secretary of the Treasury, Salmon P. Chase, continues to connive and conspire and begins now lobbying the Republican Party as the next presidential candidate nominee to replace Lincoln in the upcoming 1864 election. Throughout all this pressure, Lincoln, despite his kind of propensity for depression and melancholy, is in fighting form and good humor. In spring of May 63, the Union Army is going to again attempt to break through Fredericksburg at a line at Chancellorsville that's nearby Fredericksburg. And again, the Union Army is going to be decimated at Chancellorsville. 17,000 Union casualties versus 12,000 Confederate casualties. When Lincoln gets the news of the casualty figures, he is reported to have gone ashen and then pacing the room, muttering in despair, quote, my God, what will the country say? What will the country say? The only good news out of Chancellorsville is the death of, at least good news for the Union, is the death of Thomas Stonewall Jackson. Jackson, in the late evening, is inspecting his defensive lines, and he's mistaken for an enemy officer and shot dead by his own soldiers. Well, he's wounded by his own soldiers, not shot dead yet. And at first, it seems that Jackson will survive his wound. It's in his left arm, but then the wound becomes infected and his arm is amputated. And then the infection sets in deeper. And it becomes obvious that Stonewall Jackson is going to die. And his wife arrives to attend to him with the physician. And on Sunday, Sunday in May, Jackson is told by his wife that he will probably not live out that day. And Jackson's response is, oh, good, I always wanted to die on a Sunday. And the last words of Stonewall Jackson as he goes into a kind of delirium is giving instructions on how to water horses under the shade of the trees. He says something like, we'll now water our horses under the shade of the trees, something similar to that. And of course, the loss of Thomas Stonewall Jackson is yet another blow to the Confederacy. Certainly after the loss of Sidney Johnson at Shiloh, who again was considered to be the most talented of field officers, Jackson was also certainly comparable to Sidney Johnson. And, Jackson was the victor of the 7 Days Campaign. He forced McClellan out of the peninsula away from Richmond. Jackson saved Richmond from McClellan. And now the passing of Jackson, again, considered at this point, since the death of Sidney Johnson, the most, again, talented field officer that the Confederacy has, is very bad news in the Confederate Army and the Confederacy in general. Lincoln continues with problems that are coming at him, dealing with problems that are coming at him in the form of, again, as he calls it, fire in the rear. In Ohio, where General Burnside, after Fredericksburg, ends up being put in command of the Department of Ohio, Burnside arrests now a prominent former congressman and now Copperhead, Clement Vallandigham. And he charges Vallandigham with violating Burnside's Order Number 38, which prohibited publicly voicing sympathy for the enemy. After Vallandigham ignores that order and makes a public speech against the war, whipping up a crowd into a frenzy, calling on Union soldiers to desert and to, quote, hurl King Lincoln from his throne, end of quote, Burnside sends troops to his house and arrests him. Stripped of the protection of habeas corpus, which was suspended in Ohio as well, a military tribunal sentences Vallandigham to imprisonment for 2 years. That's how desperate and oppressive Lincoln is becoming. Criticism now comes at Lincoln not only from the Democrats, but even from his own loyal Republicans, who declare this as, quote, an invasion of a great principle, the right of free speech, end of quote. For once, Lincoln's entire cabinet are united in their opposition to Vallandigham's imprisonment, and the American press in the North condemns the whole thing. This puts Lincoln on the defensive. He'll write a letter that he intends to publish to a Democratic Party politician in New York. And he does release copies of it to the press. In it, Lincoln concedes that in ordinary times, such arrests would be unconstitutional, but that the Constitution had provided for the suspension of habeas corpus, quote, in cases of rebellion or invasion, end of quote. Moreover, Lincoln insists that Vallandigham was not arrested for speaking critically of the administration, but, quote, because he was laboring with some effect to prevent the raising of troops to encourage desertions from the army and to leave the rebellion without an adequate military force to suppress it, end of quote. Lincoln will now ensure that this letter is printed in a variety of formats and media in an incredible 10 million copies, and it will be distributed throughout the North. And it works. It's a very persuasive letter from Lincoln to the people of the United States, and it works to cool some of the criticism that is drawn by Lincoln's suspension of habeas corpus and other civil rights, and some of his summary arrests of people opposed to the war that Lincoln is waging against the Confederacy. That summer, 1863, the nation's focus begins to look at Vicksburg, the last Confederate holdout on the Mississippi River. Vicksburg will become known as the key to Mississippi, and indeed, if Vicksburg can be taken. The first part of the Anaconda Plan, the encirclement of the Confederacy, will become complete at that point. And Ulysses S. Grant, for weeks, has been besieging Vicksburg, but the people of Vicksburg are holding out just the same. And everything now, as I say, focuses on Vicksburg. And the Confederacy now, in order to force the Union away from Vicksburg, is going to adopt a strategy. Robert E. Lee will adopt a strategy that will lead to what certainly is the largest battle on the Western hemisphere in history, and the largest battle of the Civil War, and in fact, often seen as the Stalingrad of the Civil War, the turning point, although neither Stalingrad nor the Battle of Gettysburg, which is the battle I'm referring to, are actually turning points in the way we often portray them. But it will definitely be an important moment in the war, and going forward from the Battle of Gettysburg, which I'll describe in the next lecture, things are just going to get now progressively worse and worse for the Confederates.